What are the worst mistakes that young people make related to their mental health? Shout out to Dr. Mike for inspiring the topic of this video. He did this video topic with the worst health and medical mistakes that young people make. So I figured, why don't I do the equivalent of that for mental health? Because I've worked in a couple of university counseling centers. I did my dissertation on college students. So in no particular order, here are some of the biggest mistakes I think young people make that harm their mental health, and also some quick fire tips to combat each of them. One mistake that I think young people make a lot these days is this attitude of hyper-individualism. There's this myth that's very popular nowadays, especially among young people, that we are all very separate rather than interconnected. We're unable to sort of acknowledge that the things we do individually affect other people in turn, and that other people directly and indirectly also affect us. So for example, I think one way that this shows up in young people is thinking that setting boundaries happens in a vacuum, that you can just set whatever boundaries you want and anything goes because it's your boundary and you have a right to set any boundary, even ones that are not always reasonable. Another way that hyper-individualism shows up in young people is, I think, this avoidantly attached attitude that's super common, where any sort of dependence on another person is considered unhealthy, when in reality we are all dependent on other people whether or not we like it. And so the sooner we can acknowledge that and figure out healthy ways to navigate it, the better off everyone will be. Both hyper-individualism and hyper-collectivism are dangerous, and I know that there are definitely cultures out there that take collectivism to an extreme, and people struggle with that as well. But in the case of hyper-individualism, I think some of the outcomes of that include self-isolation, because you are very much isolating yourself from other connections and acknowledgement of interdependence, and also a lack of consideration of how your actions affect other people as well. So one really quick, easy way to combat this is to check in with someone you care about every single day, just to maintain that connectedness, to maintain that dependence on each other, and acknowledge that we don't exist in a vacuum. And it's okay to check in with other people rather than always be thinking about what's in our best interests. Second mistake that I think young people make related to their mental health is addiction to social media. Now, how this relates to hyper-individualism is, I think, because people are a lot more individualistic, they're a lot lonelier, they isolate a lot more. And when they isolate a lot more, they lean on social media and technology as like a proxy for connection, to fill those basic connection needs that aren't going to go away no matter how much we stifle them. And I don't think that this is entirely younger generation's fault, because in a lot of cases, it was their parents that should have set stricter boundaries around social media usage. And now we're seeing the consequences of what is called like an iPad kid generation, of people who are addicted to technology, can't focus, don't know how to socialize, and should have been taught better. Social media addiction has been associated with poorer self-esteem, anxiety, depression, body image struggles, loneliness, bullying, worse social skills, difficulties maintaining attention, worse academic performance, misinformation, and conspiracy theories. And yet, young people are spending an exorbitant amount of time on social media every single day. One really effective way to combat this that I implemented months ago, and since then I have seen countless benefits, is in the evening after dinner, instead of scrolling on my phone or watching something on Netflix or both at the same time, replacing that time with reading time. It has done wonders for myself, for my career, for my relationship. Highly recommend it. Now, while we're talking about the pitfalls of technology, there's something we need to talk about that affects all people, not just young people. And that is that we live in a world where it's extremely easy to look up a person's private information, such as their social security number, their name, date of birth, phone number, IP address, financial information, home address. And that is where the sponsor of today's video comes in, Incogni. So I've actually been using Incogni for years, so I'm very excited about the sponsorship. Here's the gist of the problem. Data brokers aggregate all your personal information and then they sell it to businesses and scammers. Just last week, nearly 3 billion people's social security numbers were leaked. And this is very scary because it exposes you to things like scams, identity fraud, harassment, stalking. The concern with the social security numbers in particular is that people could open loans in your name, which is going to deteriorate your credit score in addition to being identity fraud. And anytime you get notifications from like your bank that your information was found on the black market, or that your password was leaked in an online data breach, these are the types of issues that could come up. According to the 2022 annual data breach report by the Identity Theft Resource Center, the number of victims for such crimes increased increased by 41.5% since the previous year. And another issue here is privacy. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of these websites that, again, aggregate all your private information for people to find in one spot. Let me tell you a little bit of an anecdote on that topic. When I was setting up my clinical practice, I needed something called an NPI number. In order to apply for an NPI number, you need to have like an address where you're actually providing the services. And since I was fully remote, they wanted me to put my actual home address on this database that you can find like 2 clicks away where a person lives. And I actually called them to be like, hey, what should I do about this? I don't feel comfortable putting my home address where clients and other people can find it. They were so incredibly rude. They had such an attitude with me, and honestly, I got the sense that they probably get these calls a lot. And basically they just said like, not our problem, take it up with your governing body. And that is part of the reason why I left both the US and the field of therapy, because I was tired of feeling unprotected by the very people who were supposed to protect me. But Incogni is a way of taking matters into your own hands, not letting your protection fall in the hands of somebody that's not going to do that. It would take years to manually remove all your information from these different websites. But with Incogni, it just effortlessly happens while you're sleeping. Here's how it works. You set up an account, you grant them the right to work with brokers on your behalf to get your information removed from their websites, and then you lean back and you just let them do the work for years. Because with a yearly subscription, they make repeated removal requests, and when new things pop up, they also try to get rid of those. And they make sure that your information stays off the internet. So use the link below to get 60% off your annual Incogni subscription. Now back to the video. Another big mistake that I see young people make related to their mental health is what's called an external locus of control. Locus of control is basically what you feel controls the outcomes in your life. Someone who has an internal locus of control feels like they have the power to shape their lives, whereas someone with an external locus of control thinks that things happen to them. Outsider influences affect their trajectory, and they don't really have a lot of power to make change in their life. External locus of control has been associated with less willingness to engage in treatment, an inability to take responsibility for a person's own actions, depression, helplessness, lower well-being and life success, unhealthier behaviors, and poor coping. So it's very concerning that modern society has convinced young people to take an external locus of control, that they don't have any control over their lives, and that young people now perpetuate that mindset by saying that it's offensive if you invalidate this worldview. One example of this that I see so often is how young people will often say, my generation's never going to be able to afford a home. I understand that things are financially very tough. I know what that is like. But fatalistic attitudes like this and external locus of control ironically make it harder to accomplish those things. It's an internal locus of control that helps you surmount the very real financial challenges that we have. And to some extent, I think we need to understand where this is coming from, because younger people do have less control over their lives. In a lot of situations, they're still financially semi-dependent or completely dependent on their parents. They're told by older generations that they don't know anything about life. So there is the sense of like, the things that happen to me are not dictated by me. But once again, switching that to an internal locus of control can help you surmount the very real challenges that you face in life. So a really quick tip to combat this is, in any situation where you feel helpless or powerless, do this exercise that I included in the personal growth journal, where you draw a circle. Everything inside the circle are things within your control. Jot all of those down. Everything outside of the circle are things outside of your control. So jot all of those down, everything you can think of. Have you done everything within the circle? And how do you work on accepting everything outside of the circle? Really quick way to reroute, okay, do I have some options in this situation? If so, let me act on them. And are there things that are outside of my control? Because if so, let me stop whining about them. Another mindset associated with poor mental health that I think young people in particular struggle with these days is pessimism. Pessimism has been associated with anxiety, depression, hostility, even poor health outcomes. Pessimists literally die younger. And I think that external locus of control and pessimism work together. Taking that same example of my generation will never own a home. You have the external locus of control of there's nothing I can do to affect change in my life, paired with the pessimism of things are going to work out the worst possible. So these two really go hand in hand. And one exercise that I absolutely love, that I've been practicing a lot of, is in any negative situation, I try to identify the silver lining associated with it. So for example, last week I went to get some paperwork done, and it turned out I didn't have all the documents that I needed to do that paperwork. And at first it was like, man, that's so frustrating. We just drove like 40 minutes one way to get to this place. But the silver lining was we stopped by a cute little decor boutique on the way there, and we found a couple of items that I was looking for the new home. Now, is the glass always half full? No, I don't think that it is. But forcing ourselves to see things that way can help us come to a place of acceptance and switch into this optimistic mindset that's ironically going to get us better prepared to take action. Another thing that young people really participate in that I think is harming their mental health is hookup culture. I did my dissertation on college women's experiences in hookup culture, and I learned that participating in hookup culture has been associated with low self-esteem, emotional distress, attachment insecurity, social complications, depression, anxiety. And the worst part is that by nature of it being a culture, anybody who's not conforming to that culture is kind of pathologized and seen as weird for it. And so what you get then is a lot of people who are basically coerced into these casual acts of intimacy without realizing that they have a right to reject them in the first place. They're sold the idea that it's badass and empowering to objectify and be objectified, that it's crazy or clingy to expect emotional intimacy or sexual exclusivity. And women in particular are sold a framework of sexuality that's a lot more aligned with what men tend to want than what women tend to say they want. So a tip to combat this is, look, I'm not going to say like don't participate in this if you don't want to, but regardless of whether or not you do participate in hookup culture, I think it could be helpful to have just like a moment of self-reflection and do a journaling prompt to really get clear on what it is that you want, what does and doesn't work for you, what are your boundaries in this situation. And again, I have a lot of such prompts in the personal growth journal. And the last mistake I'm going to touch on today is young people in a lot of situations tend to avoid emotional pain because they're not really equipped with the emotion regulation and distress tolerance tools that comes with experience. They haven't yet learned that avoiding pain will only augment it. I say this constantly, but pain times resistance to pain equals suffering, meaning there's the inevitable pain of life that we will all experience, and anyone who thinks that there are people who are devoid of this are wrong. And then there's the resistance to that pain that we put up, the avoidance of that pain, which augments that pain and transforms it into suffering instead. So for example, when I was younger, when I would go through a breakup, I didn't know how to handle the pain, and so I would just avoid it and try to numb it without realizing that actually that makes things worse and that prolongs the healing process. Now, young people do have some things biologically working against them here. For example, their prefrontal cortex is not developed until age 25, which means you don't have things like impulse control and executive functioning working in tip-top shape. They also have synaptic pruning and their hormones are awry. But really, my best tip for getting out ahead of this is to practice those emotion regulation skills sooner rather than later, whether it be through what I talk about in the personal growth journal or things like the DBT handbook of worksheets. I gained a lot of emotional mastery by learning about DBT and by doing those worksheets myself. Because again, you're going to have to learn them at some point. The longer you delay, the harder your life's going to be. Thanks again to Incogni for sponsoring a portion of today's video. Don't forget to check them out below, and I'll see you soon.